Hi BookTube, it's Amy, and I'm here with a Friday Reads and an interesting fact I learned online. Apparently, according to TikTok, there is a thing called the Millennial Pause. And I'm sure you know Gen X does it too. But the Millennial Pause, apparently, is when those of us who have been on the internet a little bit longer are used to using older technology. And so we pause at the beginning of a recording just to ensure, it's actually recording. And I realized, I do that. When I press, record on my phone, I wait a second or two just to see, the time gets to a second or two before I start talking. Because certainly on older devices, if you started talking immediately, your first few words would be missing. And it occurs to me that with this latest Samsung device, I'm recording here on a Samsung Galaxy S21 or something, that's probably not necessary because the moment I press that record button, it's going to start recording. It's not like, the old BlackBerry that I recorded my first few BookTube videos on. But I don't think that's a habit that's going anywhere, so I'll continue to do the quote millennial pause, as it's called. But just thought that was a weird, interesting fact, because apparently Gen Z and the younger generation online doesn't do that. So, interesting phenomenon to observe. But on to the books. I have 3 books here that I've got bookmarks in. And this is not to say this is all I've been reading. And I think this is why it's so difficult to do Friday Reads these days. I used to do them every week, but that's when my reading habits were different. And now I dip into several books here and there, and I don't often finish a complete book in a week. So this isn't all of it. If we did all of it, I'd have to sit next to the TBR shelf over there and go along a whole row that has bookmarks in it, because I just grab, whatever looks interesting on the day when I'm sitting down to read. And it just so happened that last night, the one with the bookmark that looked interesting was Simone de Beauvoir's Day by Day, America Day by Day. And this is her travel memoir, formatted as a journal of sorts, although they're not what you would think of as, your traditional informal journal entry. They're more like essays, recounting the days she spent. But this is an account of her trip, her lecture tour, which lasted several months in 1947 in the United States. And I first started reading this in the winter. I think it was probably January or February of this year when I got this and started reading it. And I was enjoying it, but I got distracted by other things. And last night I decided to return to it. And it was fun because I got to read her visit to Niagara Falls. And let me tell you, she was not all that impressed with Niagara Falls. And I'm going to find the passage here just to read you a little bit. She is not impressed with anywhere that's too rural, any city that seems too, provincial to her, because she's used to Paris, she's used to European cities. And, here in North America, and certainly in the 1940s, Niagara Falls was one of those, huge attractions. And in the 40s and the 50s, it was a major honeymoon destination. I think it still is, although now it's sort of the Vegas of the North. Because you've got casinos, and you've got, on the Canadian side at least, there's a whole strip of kind of like kitschy attractions and, Guinness World Records and special theaters and all sorts of stuff that would really attract, tourists and children, and interesting museums. There was a rainforest cafe, a Planet Hollywood there, and then of course the falls. And she was visiting in 1947, probably before most of those attractions were there. And just as in our day, if you're coming up from the American side, most of the Americans are going to cross into Canada because the Horseshoe Falls, which is the big one that people usually think of when they think of Niagara Falls, is actually on the Canadian side. It belongs to Canada, and the Americans have smaller, slightly less impressive falls. And so for that reason, the better view is on the Canadian side. And on the Canadian side, you can actually get right up next to the Horseshoe Falls on the edge there. And so she takes a trip when she's in Buffalo and goes up to see the falls. And so she says, the car stops in front of a tourist office where colored posters offer boats and car tours. A uniformed employee grabs me because I don't have time to take a group excursion by boat. He puts me in a taxi. I pay a few dollars in exchange for a pink ticket, which I am to give to the driver when we return. He's a specialized driver who also serves as my guide. He takes his role seriously and doesn't stop talking. We follow a route along the edge of a gorge, and he describes for me all the factories that disfigure the landscape on the opposite bank. And I should note that this is the 19th of February, and so she's certainly not, seeing the falls on a beautiful summer day. This is, a cold day in February. Things are going to be icy. Things are going to be a bit frozen. The landscape isn't going to look the best. Now, I've stopped by Niagara Falls, it was late December, early January, and it's quite beautiful because of all the mist coming off of the falls that, freezes on all the vegetation and the rocks surrounding the falls. You get almost these intricate, almost ice sculptures. And when I was there, I saw some that had, frozen in the shape of a rose, which was quite interesting. But February days are not known for me being beautiful and blue. It's quite possible that it was, frigid, cold, and gray on this February day. But she says, we cross a large bridge, but then we must stop. We're entering Canada. The customs officers are used to it. All the tourists cross the river to see the falls from the Canadian side, which offers the most interesting views. Yet they examine my passport for a quarter of an hour. It's not that they find anything amiss. They simply look it over carefully. Once over the bridge, we continue to follow the gorges where the Niagara River lies hidden at the bottom. I still haven't seen the color of its waters. The driver stops in front of a small building. There's a lunchroom, a souvenir shop, and an elevator that for 50 cents takes me down to water level. I look. What else is there to do? It's water. I go back up and leave. Another stop. This time I find myself on a terrace where I can glimpse a bend of the Niagara River and a tributary that swells it. I go down, then we leave, driving in the opposite direction towards the falls. The taxi stops for me at a lookout point, then at another in the middle of a park carpeted with snow, and I finally discover the lake. Certainly in Chateaubriand's time, before the factories and tourist lodgings were built, this landscape must have been striking. Amid the pines, the lake is vast. It's not frozen, but its green and white water seems just on the verge. Perhaps, as I once read in a novel by Jules Verne, you could just throw a chunk in a chunk of ice and the entire rippling surface would freeze over. The lake is beautiful, like a Jules Verne landscape, promising all sorts of adventures and wonders. The wind stirs the green waters, revealing their keen white swells. You could cut your finger on them. Water that's both liquid and hard, choppy water, all needles and blades. If the lake suddenly froze, it would give a long, tragic moan. That would be more marvelous than the Northern Lights. Compared to the vast riches of their potential wonders, the falls themselves are a wonder that is too clearly circumscribed. Perhaps when I view them from below, I'll find them more inspiring. But I'm not ready to descend. The car climbs up a hill. I'm taken to the best lookout point. This is a 2-story building with a lunchroom and souvenirs. I take a ticket from the cashier, and I'm led into a totally dark room where I go forward, groping along a ramp. Careful. A lighted torch shows me a dark well, and all around on the walls there are frescoes depicting missionaries in long robes. The guide throws the torch into the well, and the water blazes. It was Indians who discovered this wonder, and the missionaries after them. The water is really ablaze. My guide fills a glass, which I empty, and when I've drunk, he lights some mineral deposits at the bottom, which produce a large flame. This flame doesn't burn. The guide puts his hand through it with impunity. Again, I find myself at the Chalet Theatre. And she proceeds to go, she goes down back behind the falls because there's a pathway there, and she looks at it from different angles on this tour. And then she says at the end of it, "There's nothing to do but return. Apparently in the evening, multicolored floodlights bathe the waters in enchanting colors. I can almost imagine this spectacle. Perhaps if you walk at leisure without a guide, on guard against the advertised attractions, you might succeed, despite the factories and the organized tourism, in recapturing the beauty of this great watery landscape. As for me, I've enjoyed it myself, but the way I would at a provincial circus." And then she goes on to wonder why it's not protected as a national monument. And, you know, I almost relate to her impression of Niagara Falls, because really you go and it's a tourist trap, and I'm sure it's, you know, even more of a tourist trap now, and things are even more built up because, of course, Niagara Falls is harnessed for hydroelectricity, and I guess, you know, even in her day, it was February and the falls had not frozen over. Whereas, you know, a couple hundred years ago, there were winters when the falls would actually freeze over. And I can imagine her, you know, in the Great Lakes region, looking out Lake Ontario, Lake Erie, and that choppiness of the water with the ice. Like, I know that all too well. And in really cold winters in the past, you know, the lakes, some of them have frozen over or almost completely frozen over. I think Superior is the coldest, and that one is most prone to freezing over. But you know, these days, you know, they don't really freeze over, and so you do see that choppiness, and it is a little bit disappointing to hear her, you know, disdainfully say, you know, I enjoyed myself, you know, as at a provincial circus. So she's saying, you know, it was mildly entertaining, but it wasn't, you know, this breathtaking experience. She's experienced better. And I think it's interesting that she seems to wish the trappings of civilization weren't there. And she's wishing for, you know, this wild, uninhabited Niagara Falls, which, you know, Niagara Falls is a city now. It's a port of entry, it's a border. And there's a lot of traffic back and forth between the two countries, but it is interesting to see, you know, a 70-year-old outsider's perspective of Niagara Falls. And so I've been enjoying this. Where I'm at right now, she's left upstate New York and she's headed down southwest. I think she's somewhere near California now, and she's got some interesting things to say there. And of course, you know, she was a very bold person, because she talks about, you know, going for a walk in Buffalo in the middle of the night, coming back from whatever, you know, club or bar she was in, and finding it, you know, odd that there aren't people around, because Buffalo in the 40s, I'm sure it's very similar to Buffalo now. You're not going to have the same kind of nightlife that she was used to in Paris. And she describes, you know, several of these cities that she visited as, you know, a little bit uninteresting, very middle class, provincial. She's not even that much taken with New York. She finds places she enjoys. She goes for a walk, and I think in Harlem on her own. And some of the people she's meeting are like, well, like, why would you do that? Why would you walk so far? Why would you walk alone in Harlem? But she's fairly bold, doesn't see, you know, anything dangerous about walking in some of these neighborhoods on her own after dark. And she finds, you know, some of these middle class dinner and nightclubs that she goes to very mundane and boring. And I think I highlighted how she describes it, lulling. I think she describes it as like being lulled into, yeah, here we go. In almost all the middle class places, saccharine music plays over the radio or a record player, filling your ears and finally clogging your brain. And, well, it's also interesting because she says, you know, in 1947, everyone's talking about a recession, and how she's wondering, you know, the lack of interesting nightlife for her could be because of the recession. But I think it's just a different kind of going out than she's used to in Paris. So I'm reading that one, And then I've got this one, which is a collection of letters with an introduction. The dust jacket is off, but I'm impressed because there's a ribbon bookmark. And this is Stevenson and Barrie, A Friendship in Letters. So this is Robert Louis Stevenson. And, oh, somebody's calling me. I think I'm going to answer this and let them in. So we'll just pick up where we left off before my phone started ringing. And it was just my buzzer. I think I have a package. Maybe it's books. But Stevenson and Barrie, Friendship in Letters. So this is Robert Louis Stevenson and J.M. Barrie. So to put that in perspective for you, the authors of Peter Pan and Treasure Island, corresponding with each other, but they never actually met. They only knew each other through correspondence, despite both being Scottish authors. Robert Louis Stevenson had moved off-continent to Samoa for his health, and he was living there, and he began a correspondence with J.M. Barrie, who was still back in Scotland, and they wrote back and forth for several years, right up until Stevenson's death. And there is a knock at my door, so let's pause this once more. Well, that wasn't books, but we will continue on. So Stevenson and Barrie started a correspondence. They never met in real life, but they became quite close through their letters. And so this is the entirety of what survives of their letters. And it's nice because it's, Stevenson's letter followed by Barrie's letter, and it's in order. Sometimes you get a volume of someone's correspondence and it's only one side of the correspondence, and so you don't get the full picture. Sometimes you don't know what's being responded to, or some observations or comments don't make any sense. But I'm about midway through, and it's quite funny, and some people would say there's something mildly homoerotic about these letters. Especially because at one point, Barrie says to Stevenson, I love you if you were a woman. And, it's hard to tell, is that just a joke or is it something more? But it's interesting, too, because they comment on each other's works, on articles they saw published, and on other authors. And let's just say neither of them were really much a fan of Tess of the D'Urbervilles. Stevenson describes it as, languid and false, and neither of them seem to see, realistic characters in Tess of the D'Urbervilles or much of Hardy's writing, which I think I would agree with. I'm not a fan of Hardy, and neither were they. And so I've got that on the go. And then this is one I dip into every now and then. I started reading it a couple weekends ago. But this is Alain de Botton's The Architecture of Happiness, another nonfiction book here, and it's really about the history of architecture, why things are built in certain ways. I should say the history of Western architecture, because it's this tension between classical and Gothic styles, and how the spaces we live in impact our moods, and the importance of how buildings are designed. And I've never really read about architecture before. I might not read about architecture again, but it is a mildly interesting read to sit and go through. And I had wanted to read something else by Alain de Botton, because I had read his How Proust Can Change Your Life several years ago. And I thought, well, I like that. And he's written a few other, he kind of borders the space between philosophy and a few other genres. Because certainly, it's a little bit of philosophy, but it's also, history of architecture, and he borders the space between several genres, which is interesting. And so I've been reading through that, and it's a bit of an older book, so some of the images in it aren't great quality. You can tell it was taken with a traditional camera, and the one thing I found interesting is he's talking about, weird art pieces like this, and how people find them so beautiful, and they just don't speak to me at all. And he says something along the lines of, we find them beautiful because we see human characteristics in them, which it's like, okay then, is that why I don't appreciate stuff like this? Because I fail to, see those human characteristics? Because to me, when I look at, a space or architecture, I sort of divide it between, the things I like, I realize, for the most part, are representative of like natural spaces. Whereas the things I don't like are too harsh and too sterile, and there's not enough, variability in color and variability in shade and texture. And it doesn't seem to resemble anything that I would see in nature. And I think, one of the reasons I'm especially drawn to Gothic style is because a lot of Gothic style would really make you feel the same way as, when you're standing in the middle of a forest somewhere, and you've got these big arching trees over you, and there's all sorts of crevices and interesting shades and textures and shapes and curves and angles. And whereas standing in more what we would call contemporary architecture, it just leaves me feeling sad and cold and cut off from anything that feels remotely natural and real. And I don't do too much thinking about architecture, but I just when I see this modern architecture, modern art, I'm just kind of like, what is this? And why would anyone feel good because of this, or feel at home and feel comfortable in it? And my apartment, there's nothing minimalist about it. It's filled with as many different colors and interesting things and whatnot as you can. But anyway, that is the reading in the last few days, and who knows, maybe I'll do another Friday Reads next week. I hope you're all doing well, and I hope you enjoy your weekend.